All right, welcome to week 2. So hold on to your hat because today we officially start our discussion on how to parse the complexities of color. But first, I want to take a minute out to follow up with you on your homework. I want to mention to you a conversation that I had with the production designer on the project that I'm currently working on. I've got a couple of things going, and currently one of my projects is developing some concepts for an upcoming project from Disney. And so I was having a conversation with the production designer of that show, and we were going through a binder of storyboard sketches that he's done for this show. Now, I showed you how the story department is a separate department from the art department. They're writers and artists who do their specific thing. And it's true, this production designer is not a member of that department, and to my knowledge, he has not been a member of that department. But it's been very important to him to understand right up front what the issues with the show are going to be. And so he sits down on his own, reads the script, and storyboards out the whole show. And he does it on Post-it notes. And I have to tell you, these Post-it note sketches are gorgeous and complex. They're not what you'd expect to see on a Post-it note. And he takes them and he puts them all together in a binder, with the plastic sleeves so they're all held together nicely. So we have this piece of reference in launching our show. And so I told him, these are so worked out, and yet you've banged them out so fast. And he said, well, many years ago when I was starting out, I was reading the book, The Illusion of Life, the classic text of Disney animation in the process by the famous Golden Age Disney illustrators, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson. He said, I was reading the book, and the authors talked about one of the other artists who had this ability when they had pitch meetings and when they got together to discuss story, he would sketch out ideas just as fast as the conversation went. It was amazing. And so this production designer that I was talking to said, when I read that, I said to myself, that is a skill that I really want to have. And so he sat down and he developed it. He did exactly what I launched you on last week. He, day after day, on a regular basis, did super quick sketches, just a little idea, rough it out and make it clear, rough it out and make it clear, rough it out and make it work. He would do these on Post-it notes. He did them on Post-it notes because the pressure was off. If it didn't work out, you just tear it off and throw it aside. No sweat. It doesn't make you so tense because everything's prepackaged and you have careful squares, and if you blow one of them, you have to throw out the whole page or somehow work back over it or white it out. None of that foolishness. And so he started doing these on Post-it notes, and it evolved into this incredible and helpful skill. And that's exactly the thing that we are being launched on. An incredible, useful skill, of course, is designing with color and light. And it's not easy. It takes a great deal of practice to learn how to make all of those complicated variables come together. And so we've started on that process. And I acknowledge that as you go forward from this class into your career, you may drift away from color and light being specifically your emphasis. But whatever you're most interested in, it's got to be a habit where you put in the mileage so that you become an absolute expert on that subject. Almost like muscle memory, where your eye and your hand are trained to know what to do automatically to make that thing happen. So that's the goal of the kind of homework that we launched from last week. I hope you're enjoying it. I hope you've had some fun with it. Speaking of the complexities of color then, that's the idea that we are going to tackle today. So we're going to go back to art school for a little bit and make sure we're absolutely clear on the basics of color to lay down our foundation, and then we'll get deeper and have a further understanding from there. So I recall reading an article several years ago in Science News Weekly magazine. It was an article where a group of researchers decided that they were going to figure out how many hues or how many variations of color the human eye can distinguish. Every single subtle variation, and you can imagine, it's quite a bit. You see one color and then just shift it slightly darker, or shift it slightly warmer, just the tiniest variation that the human eye can distinguish. How many subtle variations of color can the human eye potentially distinguish? Well, as you can imagine, the number that they came up with is astronomical. They came up that the human eye can distinguish 2.3 million color variations. Oh my gosh. No wonder color is so complicated. You sit down to work out color, to parse its complexities, and you've got 2.3 million possibilities in front of you. It's impossible. It's not doable. It's not manageable, so much so that it drives you to throw your hands up in the air and run screaming out of your studio. We have got to find a way to make color manageable, to make it doable, to make it clear, and even to make it simple. And the good news is it really can be done. And so that is our job today. We're going to go through over the next 3 sessions today believability, how to give a compelling believability to our artwork. Because even if we're doing high fantasy, even if we're doing extraordinarily imaginative work, there still has to be a level of believability in that work so that our audience can understand it, that they can believe in the fantasy, and they're drawn into the story that we're telling and the environments that we're creating. So believability and an understanding of the realities of color and light is absolutely essential, even for the most high fantasy work. And then next time when we meet, we'll go into the visual interests created by color harmony and color contrast. And then from there in the session following, as we continue our discussion on how to use color for theatrical storytelling, we'll go into mood and emotion and how to design color to elicit specific emotional responses from your audience. So that's how we're going to tackle color over the next several sessions of class. Today is compelling believability in our work. So let's start off as simple as possible. What is color? Well, color is the wavelengths of visible light on the scale of electromagnetic energy. On this scale of electromagnetic energy, we have very long wavelengths of energy, like radio, television broadcasts, and then it goes up into microwaves, into the infrared range. It goes up into the ultraviolet, the very, very short wavelengths like X-rays and gamma rays. They're very energetic. The shorter the wavelength, the more energetic the ray or the particle. But right here, this little band of electromagnetic energy is what your eyes are tuned to perceive. So let's zoom in on that. These visible wavelengths, ranging from 400 nanometers to the longer wavelengths of 700 nanometers. The longer wavelengths our eyes perceive as the warms and the reds. The shorter wavelengths our eyes perceive as the blues and the violets. So here's the thing that's fascinating about color. This is a random splash of color. There's no rhyme or reason. It's just a bunch of different hues of color, except for one thing. All these different colors do have just one thing in common, and that is they all have the same grayscale value. If we turn this into grayscale only with no color, they all are middle of the road, 50% gray. So if you did not have color vision, but you could only perceive light or value. And when we use the term value, just to make sure we're all on the same page, value means the relative lightness or darkness of the color that we're seeing. So if you did not have color vision but could see light and dark only, when you looked at this vivid splash of color, this is what you would see. That's it. Nil. But with color vision, you get this. So color has contrast. Color gives the world contrast. And so the fascinating thing about color is that our brain interprets the wavelengths of light in a way that is useful to us. Our brain and our eyes interpret the wavelengths of color in terms of contrast. Yellows stand in strong contrast to the violets. The warms here stand in strong contrast to the cools, the reds to the greens, and so forth. And that's a survival trait. That lets us better distinguish one object from another so that we can more successfully make our way through the world. So the mind-blowing thing is that in truth, color is only an artifact of our brain. In a scientific sense, it does not exist, because the wavelengths of light do not have any opposition to them whatsoever. When we go back and we look at the bright, vivid splash of color, and we look back at the wavelengths of light, these wavelengths of light are not in contrast to each other. The blues don't magically have some kind of opposition to the reds. The yellows don't magically have some kind of opposition to the violets. They're simply shorter wavelengths to longer wavelengths. The miracle happens in the brain. The brain interprets those wavelengths in a way that is useful to us in terms of contrast. And so if that's what's important to your brain and mine and every single member of your audience, then you have to learn to think of color and to design color in terms of contrast. And that's why the color wheel is a useful tool, because the color wheel arranges colors in terms of how they contrast with each other. So that's our number one, the first way we're discussing of parsing the complexities of color is arranging colors in the way that they contrast with each other. Now let's get to the interaction of light and form and take a look. So if this photo of a plaster cast looks a little bit off to you, if the color and the lighting looks somehow wrong, you're absolutely right. It is wrong. You take this photo and show it to anyone on the street, whether they've had any photography training or not, and they'll say, well, it doesn't look quite right. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's overexposed or something. And that's exactly the case. I know. I took this photo myself. It is indeed a bad photo, and it is overexposed. So what happens when it's overexposed is the lights are too light. They don't have enough value to carry the proper hue. What's happening? We zoom way in here to show what's happening. We have a red light on a light gray object. And when you have a red light on an object, the highlights reflect the most of that light source back to your eyes. So of course, the highlights are going to have the most red. But then as you curve around the object, more and more gray influences. And so what should happen is the lightest highlights have more red. And then as you transition away from that highlight, you get more and more of the color of the object, which in this case is gray. We're getting exactly the opposite here. There's less red in the highlight, it's a little more washed out, and there's more red in the halftone area. That is exactly the opposite of what should really happen. And so I've taken this and done a Photoshop paint over of it to correct it, to show you what would really happen when a red light interacts with a light gray object that has a cool ambient light on it. In this case, there's a skylight in the room, so you have cool light coming onto this object here in the shadows. Here's the paint over, and now you see it. In the highlight, you get the most red, but then as it transitions away from that light source, you get more and more of the local color of the subject. So we do our crazy zoom in again, and sure enough, the highlight is the most red, and as you curve away, it gets more and more gray, more and more the color of the object. Okay? That's how color of light interacts with color of surface. It's very simple, but I'm frankly shocked at how often this is missed and how often something this very basic is misunderstood. I'm currently teaching a live class, in a real classroom, brick and mortar walls, and these are really good students. It's an advanced class, a later term class. Now, I didn't teach their initial classes. I didn't teach their initial color or lighting classes, but something in there was missed because many of the students haven't seemed to grasp this most basic principle, even though they're further in the program. And so I'm doing my best to correct that, because without this simple knowledge of how color of light interacts with color of surface, your ability to get compelling believability in your work is lost. So let's make sure we understand this. Let's do it again. Proof of concept here. Another badly shot, overexposed photo. Obviously, I'm not a photographer. Thank goodness I know what I'm doing in Photoshop, because I do that paint over, and now we get exactly what we're expecting. Highlights have more of that red light source, but as we curve away from those highlights, we get more and more neutral, more and more gray. I really want to drive this. I know it's so simple, and maybe it'll seem like I'm harping on it when I really need to move on, but I'm going to do it anyway. Let's bring that into Photoshop. Proof of concept. What we said is that the highlight should be the most red because it's a vivid red light, and then as we move away from the highlight, it will become more and more gray. Not because it always becomes more and more gray, because this object happens to be a gray object. More of the color of the light source, graduating to more of the local color of the object. All right? Color picker. Okay, so let's select some of that highlight, and here we go. Okay, if you're familiar with Photoshop, and I have to assume that you are, this is as saturated when it's right up against that edge. That means it's as saturated as you can go. Now let's move over from that edge. Okay, a little darker, a little more neutral. See that? I hope there's enough resolution on your screen you can see how that's moving. Let's go a little bit further over. See that? Darker, more neutral, moving away from the light source into a more neutral subject. Let's do it again. See that? Okay, let's do it one more time. Let's get our most saturated spot there, and watch how that. Okay, a perfect curve as it transitions from lighter and more saturated to darker and more neutral. Does everyone get the point? That's what color of light does as it interacts with the surface. So let's make sure we're familiar with the terminology. And this is, I know, where I mentioned right up front, we're going back to art school. We're hitting the basics here to lay our foundation and then to move further from there. So just so that we're on the same page with our terminology, in this painted sphere, we have highlight, halftone light, core shadow, bounce light or reflected light, this lighter area here that's getting bounce light from the ground plane. Atmospheric light, there's a secondary light source here because this is as if we're outside in the sunlight. We have the direct light of the sun. We also have the secondary cool light of the sky. So you get this cool atmospheric light here in the shadow and the planes that are tipping upwards. You also get it here in the shadow, of course, in the cast shadow, but you don't get it in here because not much light, if any, can get into this deep occlusion. So that's the photographic term for this dark area in here. It's an occlusion. Light is occluded from getting into that deep recess. Highlight, halftone light, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow, occlusion, atmospheric light within the shadows. That'll be our very simple terminology for light and shadow. So let's confirm this by looking at what happens under some different light sources. So if we take our painted sphere and we treat it as if it's now not under direct sunlight and skylight, but rather under skylight, we get something like this. Sure enough, just as promised, you get the highlight is more of the color of the light source, but as you transition away, this is a warm object in the range of flesh tones, in the range of human flesh tones from very light to very dark. This local color is somewhere in the middle of that range. And so the highlight is more the color of the light source, the cool skylight, but transitions to more and more of the local color of the object. And then with the soft indirect light source, you don't get the kinds of cast shadows, of course, that you would get under direct light. So this is the result. And this is confirmed by the great painter, even in a quick sketch, who always nailed this kind of thing, John Singer Sargent. In this study of his father under a skylight, that is exactly what you're seeing. The transition from the highlight to the halftone to the shadows, exactly the same idea that we're seeing here. Again, a beautiful portrait study by the artist Morgan Weistling. This is done under a skylight. And so you see the highlights, the lightest lights have those cooler tones, but graduating to the rich, hot flesh tones that our subject here has. And if we put on theatrical lights, if we put a colored gel over our light source, so it's a vivid blue, for instance, sure enough, highlight, color of the light source, still transitioning to the local color of our subject. And as a proof of concept of that, we can look at our hero here, the actor Cillian Murphy. Fantastic actor. I don't know if you're a fan, but I'm just a big admirer of the guy as an actor. And so he was in that sci-fi film, what was it called? I think it was called Sunshine. Interesting movie. The ending was mixed. Ending was questionable in my opinion, but a beautiful science fiction movie visually. And this is a scene, a close-up on him from that movie, under a very cold light source. Proof of concept, highlight, cold, transitioning to warm shadows. Okay. So I hope I've hit this so hard that it's clear. And so now you've got to put it in the context of an environment. You have to know what happens under all the circumstances where light interacts with form.